to the PCN Capitol Preview. I'm Francine Schertzer. Today we'll talk about the state budget. You can join our discussion by calling us toll-free at 1-877-PA6-5001 or text us at 717-219-4001. But first, we're joined by Aliya Schneider, politics and governing reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
You recently wrote that U.S. Senator John Fetterman's fight with the left extends beyond the issue of Israel. What are some of the other issues where he diverts from progressive views?
Yeah, so John Fetterman has kind of already been on thin ice when it comes to progressives because of his staunch support for Israel. He's really kind of had this unconditional support for Israel, while other progressives are more focused on the death toll in Gaza. He's been more focused on October 7th and, defeating Hamas and supporting Israel. And he's, the senator can be pretty brash with some of his remarks and his memes and just the way he sticks to his points. But recently we've been seeing that he's been unafraid to kind of make waves within his own party beyond the topic of Israel. We've seen that through a couple of viral videos, actually. One of them was an environmentalist who is one of his constituents, and she was trying to speak to him about a pipeline. And he was kind of just mocking her and recording her on his phone and just kind of making sarcastic remarks and just really clearly didn't care what she was saying and just was really dismissing her. And I think that further, made progressives upset. Another instance was a video that a lot of us have seen from Congress on the House floor where Marjorie Taylor Greene criticized Jasmine Crockett's appearance. And then Jasmine Crockett kind of shot back, and AOC stepped in and was defending her colleague. And John Fetterman shared that video on X, formerly known as Twitter, and said that he used to compare Congress to the Jerry Springer show, and now he apologizes to the Jerry Springer show. And so, people didn't like that he was mocking the scene as a whole, including his colleagues. And so one of his former staffers actually had kind of shot back at him by saying, she used to think that he had character and empathy, and she apologizes to people who also thought that. And AOC also kind of shot back at his response and essentially called him a bully. And then also he has been splitting from his party a bit when it comes to immigration and kind of being a little stricter at the border. We've also seen some willingness to collaborate with some Republican colleagues. And he really has been voting mostly in lockstep with his party, but we are kind of seeing this willingness to kind of push away from the status quo within his party and use that kind of brashness that he's known for, not just towards Republicans, but also towards members of his own party and former supporters.
On the topic of staff, you wrote that in the midst of Senator Fetterman's perceived political shift, he's lost staff. What do you take from that?
Yeah, so he's, it's fairly normal for politicians to be losing staff members, but he's kind of had a lot leaving within a certain time frame that has been since he's become very outspoken about Israel. And a couple of his staffers went to very clearly progressive jobs. And one of those staffers kind of praised his new boss for being, very progressive. And I think, a lot of people view John Fetterman as a progressive. He says he's not one, but a lot of his base that elected him are progressives. And a lot of Republicans viewed him as a progressive. And in the past, he did repeatedly describe himself as a progressive. But during his 2022 campaign, he was kind of distancing himself from that term and said, I'm just a Democrat. So it's definitely this kind of view that a lot of people have had from him that he's trying to pull away from.
How has Senator Fetterman's perceived political shift affected both his relationships not only with Democratic members, but also with the Republican Party?
Yeah, I mean, Republicans who previously saw him as this really dangerous progressive, he doesn't follow the traditions of Congress. He wears whatever he wants. And they just saw him as this really progressive guy who they would attack and they would make fun of him. And now they're kind of showing they're saying that they have more respect for him and that he's kind of pleasantly surprising them.
You wrote that Senator Fetterman was invited to speak at a Democratic fundraiser in Florida last month. Some progressives wanted his appearance canceled. Do you think this is a signal of perhaps a deeper rift within the party itself?
I do think so. I think time will tell and we'll see more of that. But I do think right now, especially when it comes to Israel, there is a rift in the party, especially when it comes to kind of progressivism within the party. And also we're seeing it with Joe Biden and a rift within the voter base. And, we've done reporting on young voters, for example, who are really reluctant to vote for Biden because they're upset about his support over Israel. The Democratic Party trying to convince those voters, that Joe Biden's still the best option. And I think, some people are saying they're not going to vote at all because they don't like other options. So I do think that this is indicative of a larger shift that's happening within the party.
How is Senator Fetterman responding to the perception of him picking fights with the left?
Well, he kind of just shrugs it off. So, for example, when he was asked about AOC calling him or implying that he's a bully, he called it absurd and said that he was commenting on the general atmosphere on the House floor. So I think he's not really entertaining that exactly in the way that people are perceiving it.
Aliya Schneider, thank you for joining us this morning.
Thank you so much.
More of the PCN Capitol Preview after this short break. Welcome back. Our guests today are Chris Nicholas from Eagle Consulting Group and Brit Crampsie from Brit Crampsie Communications. We're less than a month away from the governor's from the state budget deadline. Looking back at what Governor Shapiro proposed back in February, what seems likely to pass?
That is the $49 billion question, I think, this year. I think he'll see a lot of his initiatives funded, a lot of the goals that he set, but whether he gets them at the levels that he's proposed, I think, is the real question. So this is his second budget process. The first one went not so great. We had a lot of hurt feelings by the end of it. It was a little late. Folks were a little bit unhappy, in the legislature. And now we have the added pressure of it being an election year. So every member of the House is either retiring or up for election, and half of the Senate, which of course does not reduce tension in the legislature.
Chris, your thoughts?
I would agree with all of that. The governor left Republicans at the altar last year when he reneged on his deal for school vouchers, an additional flight of school vouchers. So he has to deal with that mistrust that he created then. And the logjam in the legislature is still the same. Republicans have a 3-seat majority in the Senate, and Democrats have a 1-seat majority in the House. So that math is the same as it was last year, even though we've had so many, it seems like, special elections.
Roughly about a month ago, Senate Republicans proposed their budget plan, which involved spending down parts of the surplus to provide a property or personal income tax reduction. What do you think about that plan?
I think it's a great plan. I think it's a terrific idea to give money back to the people who gave it to government in the first place, which is us, right? So Democrats, I think, will want to muddy the waters and put conditions on it, and you have to get a tax credit or some other thing. The Senate Republican plan was pretty simple. We're going to roll back everyone's personal income tax, the PIT, which right now is 3.07. It would be rolled back to what it was before Governor Rendell pushed it. I think it was like 2.8 something, but don't hold me to that. But it would be, significant money in everyone's pocket every time they get paid, every 2 weeks, twice a month, whatever the case may be. So not only is that a good idea, Francine, it's easy to communicate to people because it's very simple. We're going to cut your taxes so you get more of your own money back. That's pretty easy to communicate.
Do you think that Senate Republicans truly want to reduce the surplus?
Yeah, because the surplus is there because we've paid too much in taxes. So, okay, let's right-size things. The Democratic plan is always to invest, which just means spend more money. So let's let families spend money because they know how to do it better than anyone else.
What do you think about that?
It's so tough to argue against a tax cut. Nobody likes paying taxes. I don't love paying taxes. But we have to make investments in the state. And I think the problem with the Senate Republican plan is not returning money back to the taxpayers. That's great. But they have been arguing for the last several years that we can't spend down. We can't touch the surplus. We can't touch the rainy day fund. But if you cut taxes, that's cutting the amount of money that we're bringing into the state year after year. So it actually cuts further into our savings than the governor's plan to make investments, which they said was too expensive. So I think this was a messaging play for them. Like I said, it is very difficult to argue against tax cuts, but they're coming at the expense of investments that they said were already too expensive.
I always chuckle when my Democratic friends say Republicans cutting taxes, proposing to cut taxes, is just a messaging play. It's not. It's a core tenet of the Republican Party is to keep taxes and spending down. So I can guarantee it's not just a messaging play.
They have no, I believe, prospect of passing this. So it was not done in negotiation with the House Democratic Caucus, who will also have to provide the votes to pass it, nor with the governor, who will have to sign it. It may be one of their core beliefs. It is not a practical starting point for a budget proposal.
What do they accomplish then by making this vote, knowing that the House Democrats likely won't pass it?
I think it's a shot across the bow. The governor gets to do his budget address. He has the whole stage. He gets everybody there to watch it. And Senate Republicans are staking out clearly where they are, or maybe just that they oppose what the governor has said. But they have their line. The governor has said his, and now we'll find a budget somewhere in the middle.
So as Brittany said earlier, everybody in the House is either retiring or up for election. So I look forward to House Democratic leadership making their members walk the plank and vote against giving people a tax cut 4 months or 3 months, whatever the case may be, before Election Day. That'll be very interesting messaging, huh, Brittany?
I don't imagine that we're even going to see this bill up for a vote in the House. It doesn't work. The numbers don't add up. You can either cut taxes and spend down forever, or you can make investments that communities need. And I think the House Democrats are going to put up a budget bill that invests in the state instead of dwindles its resources.
So Democrats don't mind spending down the surplus to increase spending. They do mind spending down the surplus by giving us our own money back. That to me is a very, very stark contrast.
Now, Governor Shapiro's proposal invested money in particularly mass transit and additional money toward education. What happens to these programs if that funding isn't directed in those ways?
They don't happen, simply. And the Commonwealth Court has said that our K-12 public education system is unconstitutionally underfunded. We have failed the constitutional obligation to provide for public schools. That requires not only an increase in investment, but also a legislative change to change how we invest those dollars. So it's not enough money and it's not fairly distributed. That has to be addressed. That can't be addressed if we are giving away the money that we have saved for it.
We are going into the 8th or 9th year where we will have, I'm not going to air quote anymore, I've already done that twice, where we're going to have supposedly record investment in K through 12 education. So 8, 9, 10 years straight of record investment in K through 12, and it's still not enough for my friends on the left. At some point you have to say, what return on the dollar are we getting for all of this record investment?
Well, I think that's a fair question, but 9 years of record investment follows 30 years of record underfunding. Pennsylvania falls very far to the bottom of the barrel compared to other states. We're supposed to do 50% of funding from the state, 50% from local governments. And now that number from the state is dwindling as low as 25% in some districts. It's not enough to keep up, and 9 years is not enough to make up the difference.
If I may, Chris, just want to remind our viewers that you can call in and join our discussion. Our toll-free number is 1-877-PA6-5001, or text us at 717-219-4001. Our first call today comes from Clearfield. Robert, you have the floor.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Nicholas should keep advocating for tax cuts. Okay, that's fine. My question is, he says, what segment of Pennsylvania's population is going to suffer the most, and what geographical area of Pennsylvania is going to suffer the most? I can tell you that straight up and down who's going to take the worst of the brunt of the suffering. That's going to be Pennsylvania's rural population, which is diminishing in number, and he said it'll be Pennsylvania's rural communities, especially those west of State College, because you and I both know that all political power is now now rest in the eastern half of Pennsylvania. So you can holler for tax increase and say, let's see who you propose to suffer the consequences. Thank you.
Well, I'm actually advocating for tax cuts. I don't think that would harm rural Pennsylvania. I would remind our caller that the vast majority of rural Pennsylvania is represented by Republicans. My Democratic friends, they just don't have a very big footprint in that part of the state. They much more likely to represent urban areas. So one of the neat things about cutting everyone's PIT is it's everyone's PIT.
Now, a moment ago, we were talking about education. Is money the sole fix for our educational system?
No, I think we need several funding formula corrections. So right now, we have a hold harmless fund for education. So you can't get less than you did the previous year. But as our caller mentioned, and I think Chris has said, that it's dwindling population in these rural areas. So their funding is slightly skewed. There are areas that have grown rapidly and it's not catching up. There are areas where cost of living and inflation has hit harder, and they're not getting an appropriate amount of money. We're not funding cyber charter schools in an appropriate way. They're getting far more funding than they need, and they're sitting on tons and tons of public money. We need to address that. And then the special education funding is still a little bit off and needs to be increased. So we have a couple of buckets that fall into that public K through 12 education. Their formulas need to be changed, and we also need to rise the level of the funding for each of them.
Chris, what changes would you like to see beyond funding?
Well, school districts have for the most part, record budget balances, surpluses, and that needs to be taken into account. There needs to be more accountability across the board, and we have to be careful about what I call mission creep, which is saying that all these decisions have to come from Harrisburg and the governor and the Department of Education. All of our school districts have elected school boards, and that's where most of the decisions should be made because they have a better idea of what's happening in their towns and boroughs than someone does in Harrisburg.
Earlier this spring, the Senate Education Committee approved the Lifeline Scholarship Program, which has been compared to vouchers. Do you foresee any scenario where a vouchers type plan is included in the budget?
Well, I think it's going to be included in the budget negotiations. We saw the governor Welch on his promise last year to get them through because House Democrats protested. So is Matt Bradford, the state rep from Montgomery County, who is the House Democratic leader, is he solely in charge of priorities for the Democratic Party? Because that's sure what it seems like right now. So if you have all the Republicans who want those scholarships, the governor campaigned on it, talked about it in his first budget address. So at some point you would think, boy, they'd be able to persuade one House Democrat to vote for it. So I think if Representative Bradford would bring that bill to a vote, I think it would pass. The problem is they're so against that idea that they won't even let it come to a vote. So I would just simply say to Representative Bradford, let that come for a vote, and if it passes, great, and if it doesn't, okay, the will of the people has been done.
There are a lot of interesting inconsistencies in Republican budget logic, but I think vouchers is one of the more interesting ones. They want to call for accountability in funding. They want performance-based funding for all these public institutions. But Lifeline scholarships are a giveaway to private, unaccountable, and religious schools throughout the state. So these schools don't have to meet the same standards that public K through 12 schools do. There are no metrics for their success. We are just giving them a blank check. And in other states that have these programs, they're often going to students that are already enrolled in private schools. So it's not addressing the problem that Republicans say that it is. And further, to say that the governor welched on his deal or went back, I don't think is accurate. Shapiro has been very clear that he wants this, but he speaks for the executive branch. He's the governor. He can't make promises for the legislature. The House Democrats existed before him. They'll exist after him. They come up with their own votes. So he can't promise, nor can he fail to deliver their votes. They're a separate and equal branch of government that need to be taken into account here.
So I think that's about the biggest canard from my friends on the left about private schools, that somehow there's no accountability. They have to account for all their money every year because they're not guaranteed to get it from the government every year, regardless of what happens, which is what public schools do. Getting a child into private school is important, but using those scholarships to keep them there is just as important, okay? Private schools here do a terrific job educating our kids at a much lower cost than public schools do, and that's for a whole variety of reasons. And there are waiting lists in Philadelphia 30,000 kids want to get into charter schools and private schools and can't because they don't have the funds. So I'm kind of the all of the above when it comes to education. If public schools in your part of the world are great, excellent. If they're not, let's do something a little different, because it's more important to get the kid educated than it is to worry about adults getting their, getting upset about something.
But vouchers just poke holes in the public education system. They take a single student out of a classroom, take every dollar allocated for them out with them, but it doesn't reduce the cost for the classroom. You don't close a classroom when one student leaves, you don't fire a teacher, you don't turn the lights off there. They have all the same costs, and now they have fewer resources with just one fewer student. These private schools can also reject any student they want. So if a student costs more to educate because they have an IEP or a developmental disability or anything, the private school can reject them. So they're able to take the students that cost the least to educate and then take the whole average of what it costs to educate a student in Pennsylvania. It doesn't make sense for our public schools, and we're allowing our public schools to fail because we're taking away their resources and then blaming them for not succeeding.
Here's a guarantee: if you closed every private school in Philadelphia and sent those kids back to the public school that they would go to, there's no way the city education system could handle that without huge tax increases. So for kids who want that and parents who want it, it's a good deal all around because they do it less expensively than public schools.
Britt, if I could direct this toward you, vouchers are traditionally supported mostly by Republican members. That being said, with few exceptions, perhaps Senator Anthony Williams comes to mind, Democrats have traditionally opposed vouchers. Is that a hard sell when they're representing an area like Philadelphia or Pittsburgh that has some of the more troubled schools?
Sure, and there's no denying that we have troubled schools. We have schools with lead in the paint and asbestos in the buildings. There are schools in Philadelphia where they don't have air conditioning. But taking one student, taking 5 students out of that classroom and putting them in a private school leaves the other 20 in that still same situation. So I think the argument, I know the argument from Democrats, is that we need to improve the experience and quality and resources for every child, and not just taking one out and putting them into a private school where the teachers aren't necessarily certified and they don't take standardized tests and they meet none of the same requirements that PDE sets for public schools.
Private school teachers are very well educated and into their jobs. That's another kind of slap in the face. And so let's not help those 5 kids. Let's keep them with the other 20 that are being miserable because they don't have the best classroom available. And why do those Philadelphia schools not have air conditioning? One party has run them for 2 generations. They've been lavished with money over the decades, and they have still bad paint and asbestos and no air conditioning. That's not because they have a lack of funding. That's because they don't run the schools in the most efficient way. So giving the same people more money to do the same less than terrific job seems to me to be a fool's errand.
While we're on the topic of education, perhaps a slightly different facet, the governor had offered his proposal for higher education funding, particularly making it more affordable for those attending state system and community colleges. Can you talk a little bit about what we know about the governor's plan and where it is right now legislatively?
So the governor's plan includes merging the community college system with the PASHE system, the state schools, your Kutztown, Bloomsburg, IUP, and creating a new overhead organization for them, allowing students to move about the programs. And I think it also includes an amount of scholarship, a new funding, a new board. And I think the goal here is to ensure that students can go to PASHE schools. They're supposed to be an option for every student in Pennsylvania, and that they can afford to do so. Again, lack of state funding has led tuition, room, and board to inch and inch and inch up to the point where PASHE schools are no longer the affordable option in Pennsylvania. So his goal, I think, is wonderful, to address that, to increase enrollment, to make higher education an option. I don't think it's moved legislatively yet. I know the Senate Republicans have also proposed a plan that takes a lot of these tenets and maybe removes some of the administrative pieces and instead puts more money into scholarships. So I think that's a good place where we're going to see some compromise between Senate Republicans and the governor.
Our PASHE schools do a very good job educating our college graduates, our college students. And speaking here as someone who has put 2 kids through school, I can definitely say that it impacts your budget. I don't see anyone out there running around saying, let's combine 2 totally different systems with different goals, the community colleges and the PASHE schools together. I think that's window dressing. I don't think that's going to move.
We're going to give our guests a brief break so I can tell you about some upcoming programming here on PCN. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow morning as we discuss the 2024 general election with Ray Zaborny of Red Maverick Media and former Democratic State Committee Chair Jim Byrne. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. Join us for On the Issues this week as we sit down with Rick Seeger, Secretary of the Department of Community and Economic Development, to discuss Governor Shapiro's economic development strategy. That's followed by an interview with Timothy Schaefer, Executive Director of the Pennsylvania Fish and Boat Commission. He'll discuss licensing processes and Safe Boating Week. That's Wednesday night, starting at 7. If you enjoy PCN's coverage of politics and policy, sign up for our political newsletter, the PCN Capitol Review. There you'll find highlights of the day's news, along with links to live event coverage and PCN original shows. To subscribe, visit PCNTV.com. Thank you for watching PCN. PCN is a 501c3 nonprofit television network that receives no government funding. We're relying on viewers and donors like you to help PCN continue to bring you everything Pennsylvania. To make a donation, visit PCNTV.com. Now, before we get into more specifics of the governor's budget proposals, we've been talking a lot about how Pennsylvania has a $14 billion surplus. Just looking back historically, is it easier or more difficult to get a budget passed based on whether or not you have a surplus? And maybe look at some of these prior administrations that you've served under and who's done it well? Who's handled this more efficiently?
I think we have budget issues whether there's $1 million in the bank or $14 billion, because everyone's priorities come to a crescendo during that time, and everybody wants their program funded or their program to get a 3% increase over the previous year. We've had Democratic governors, unfortunately, for way too long in the last bit of modern history. So there's always been a push to have to increase spending. So again, this surplus is all of our money. Part of it is from the federal COVID relief program. Where did that money come from? Came from the federal government that we fund and all your viewers fund. Part of it is the rainy day fund, which again comes out of our pockets. Part of it is the economy and tax collections are doing a little bit better according to the independent fiscal office. So all that money adds up. It's our money. It's not the state government's money.
If you look back at prior administrations, are there governors that you think were really good deal makers that perhaps Governor Shapiro could learn something from?
What an interesting question. I think that Governor Wolf did very well with this, and he was presented with a lot of challenges. So under Corbett, we received a bunch of stimulus money from the federal government, but they allocated it in such a way that when it went away, there were no backfill solutions. So when that money ran out, we saw $1 billion cut from public education. Governor Wolf comes into this, makes deals with the Republicans, and he had a fully Republican legislature, so he didn't have House Democratic caucus backing him up, and was able to make major increases in funding, those record increases that Chris loves to talk about in public education. So I think there were some lessons to be learned from that. But Shapiro is in such a unique position. I believe he is the only governor in the country that is dealing with a divided legislature. So we're used to having, in Pennsylvania at least, a Republican legislature, a Democratic governor, and there's that headbutting. Corbett had the benefit of having a full Republican trifecta, and that didn't work out so great either. So having a bit of a divide can sometimes lead to a better product, but the level of division we are seeing from within a branch is so unique that I'm not sure Shapiro can glean anything from previous Pennsylvania governors or even governors across the country.
The best deal maker by far was Ed Rendell. Was part of his modus operandi. And John Prezell ran the House then, a Republican from Philadelphia. Very unique to have a Republican with power in the legislature. They were both from Philadelphia. Obviously, the Republicans had pretty secure control of the Senate, so that made the squabbling a little bit easier because there was one fewer voice. There's Republican voice and a governor, and now we have the cacophony that is the House Democrats trying to hang on to their one-seat majority. So I would say Rendell was the real deal maker because that was just in his power. Tom Wolf to me was after the first year or two, I think, very disinterested in the minutia of being governor. So I didn't really, think he was the best deal maker. Now, he may not have wanted to be a deal maker, so that's fine. You don't always have to be a deal maker.
Does it help that Governor Shapiro served in the House previously?
I think so, and I think a lot of his colleagues are still there, and he gets the pressures that they're under, and to some degree vice versa, because he has open lines of communication there. I think that what we forget about Rendell is that he had these budgets go on and on until December, and he was able to essentially starve out the legislature. If there's no budget passed, there's no spending for legislative payroll. So they sit on a little bit of a fund to accommodate that. But as you get into September, October, November, payments aren't quite being made. And Rendell played hardball in a way that I don't know if we'll see out of Shapiro.
Does it help that Shapiro was in the House for a couple terms way back? Maybe on the margins. But he's governor now. It's a totally different role.
Let's go back and look at some of the specifics that were proposed back in February. The governor's once again proposing a minimum wage increase, this time $15 an hour. Chris, how's that sitting with members of the Republican caucuses?
I think a lot of people in general just look around the economy and say you'd have to work pretty hard to find somebody making minimum wage or even close to minimum wage. There always seems to be inordinate amount of attention put on people who work at fast food restaurants, which are called quick serve restaurants, QSRs in the industry. And that's a pretty small slice of the economy. So I think the market has done what it always does, which is it has adjusted incomes to suit the current market. So I don't think there's any interest. I don't think there's much interest in the Republican Party in increasing anything close to $15. About 4 years ago, there was a chance to increase it to $10 an hour. Republicans were ready to do that, but at the last minute, Democrats said no, it wasn't enough, so we were stuck at 7.25. So, kind of letting the perfect get in the way of the good has kept it mired there. But I mean, again, go find someone who for more than 3 or 4 months is making minimum wage. It's not a reality in today's economy where we have so many people competing for the number of qualified employees out there.
I think Chris's details are a little fudgy here. So it was about 5 or 6 years ago, the Republican-controlled Senate passes a $9.25 per hour minimum wage increase as part of the fiscal code. It's a vehicle that goes along with the budget. It gets sent over to the more conservative House Republican caucus, who is then in control. They refuse to move it. So this is Republican blockage on minimum wage since, I believe, 2005 when we last successfully passed one. And I don't understand, if no one is making $7.25 an hour, why can we not, as a state, say that we respect workers enough to say that they should never be paid that little? They shouldn't be paid below 10, 12, below 15. It is a poverty wage. You would have to work nearly 3 full-time jobs to afford an average apartment and groceries and utilities in Pennsylvania at that rate. This can be a principle-setting moment for Pennsylvania. Every state around us, every single state around us, those that are further right than we are, have a higher minimum wage. We are at the base federal lowest that you can provide a worker. And it's not just the 725 workers we're talking about. We're talking about the 925s, the 1015s, the 1225s. All of these people deserve a wage. They are working full-time and condemned to live in poverty. That is absolutely not the intent of the minimum wage. It was to be a rate where you could support yourself and a family. We're not even close to that. So if no one is making below 15, why don't we set the floor where we think it's livable? To say 725 is livable is just, it's shameful and it's disrespectful to workers.
So if you make it 15, everyone has to get 15. You increase everybody's costs, all the businesses' costs. I've yet to have a Democratic friend tell me where businesses are going to magically pull that out of the sky and pay people more. People are already reacting to higher prices in the retail economy, and one of the reasons is because those wages have been bumped up by government fiat. So these companies can't replace their workers fast enough with ordering kiosks and stuff, and that's why you have such inflation when it comes to food, which is very, personnel intensive to produce and get to consumers. So I think most people, when you look at the books, would say it's great to say all those terrific things that Brittany did, but where does the money come from? It doesn't grow on trees, right? I think that's true.
But if every worker is already making 15 an hour or more, like Chris says, why would why would prices have to increase if we're saying that the state minimum rate is 15? There's no increase. And I love fast food. I travel a bit, I love fast food. I don't pay more for my Wendy's order in Pennsylvania than I do in New Jersey, where they pay their workers more. It's not going to cause major increases. But what it is going to cause is minimum wage workers spending more in their communities. If you put more money in people's pockets based on the work that they're doing, they're going to spend it on retail. They're going to make improvements to their homes. They are going to keep the economy flush across the board. Right now, when you're making a poverty wage, you're not able to spend. So those small businesses aren't making money back by selling their goods. Increasing the minimum wage is good for everybody. And to Chris's point, if everybody's making it, why would there be an increase in cost at all?
I don't think I said everybody's making $15 an hour. I said I don't think people are making $7.25 an hour. So if someone is making $13 an hour, now they have to make 15. Guess what the person making 15 says to their boss? You need to pay me more than this guy. So his rate goes from 15 to 17. The person making 17 says I do more than him, so it goes to 19. So you get a huge increase in your wage scale, and that's just untenable for a lot of businesses. So many of my Democratic friends don't come from the private sector. They come from unions and nonprofits and government, which is fine. But, working for nonprofits and stuff is just a different ballgame than working for a for-profit business.
How do you determine what the appropriate rate should be?
I think we have the average rates of something like mortgage or rent, utilities, groceries. We know what it costs to live. Those studies exist. We also know that somebody who is working, we know this because this is a deeply held belief of at least Democrats, that if you are working full time, you should not be living in poverty. There should be dignity established with your work product. And that means that you should afford a roof over your head. You should be able to afford groceries. Other states have gone before us and done the research, and none of them are seeing mass shuttering of small businesses because they raised the rate to $12 or $15 an hour. We have lessons learned from other states. We have research. We have data. We can set a reasonable rate. 15 is not unreasonable.
So your plan is to go from 7.25 to 15 like that, and you don't think it's going to have any impact on the private sector economy? That's ludicrous. You can't just more than double the wage on one day and expect the economy to keep rolling along. I think my friends on the left need a little bit more exposure to the real world.
As a small business owner, I do understand a little bit of this, but I don't think we should have let it get to this point. We should have done the 9.25 6 years ago, and we can do what a lot of other states do and assign a COLA to it. So that means that as inflation increases, it gets bumped up. So we never end up in a position where we are at half of what we should be getting paid. The legislature does it for their salaries, and we don't worry about whether that's going to bankrupt the state. So I think that that is an appropriate way to deal with this moving forward. We avoid these debates. The market has set it essentially with the rate of inflation. So we know that people are able to afford their housing, afford their groceries, afford their utilities, and we don't have to make it a political debate. It shouldn't be political. It is about basic human dignity and work.
The government mandating what you have to pay your people, that involves politics. So there you go.
If you leave the private sector fully unregulated, you see things like child labor. You don't have the weekend. You don't have the 8-hour workday. These were all victories of working people.
It's not 1916 anymore.
Thank goodness. I mean, the power of working people, organized labor, makes these wins, makes this progress for workers, and minimum wage is another part of that.
Let's shift our focus and look back a little bit more at the governor's plan for mass transit. He's proposed roughly an investment of $1.5 billion over the next 5 years toward mass transit agencies. What would this funding mean for those agencies?
I think it's life-changing, particularly or organizationally changing for big systems like SEPTA, where they transport a whole lot of people to and from work every day, and they need to make necessary safety improvements, staffing increases. I think it makes a huge difference for commuters in larger cities to get around without the use of a personal vehicle, which is huge.
That's the yin and the yang of when you put out transportation dollars. Are you building more roads and bridges, or are you putting money into systems like SEPTA, which help move a lot of people in a smaller amount of space? It's just a natural tension because you have a lot of legislators who say, boy, my constituents, they don't ever go on SEPTA, and why should we give money to these, not to pick on SEPTA, but a lot of them do not have the ability to really balance their books and run in a cash flow positive manner. So their whole system is always coming to the government and saying, you have to catch us up. So there needs to be a little bit of give and take on each side. But I think we'll end up with, again, with this surplus we're dealing with, there'll be enough money to take care of priorities for those folks in urban areas as well as for folks who, will never set foot on the L train in Philadelphia.
Yeah, just to follow up, how do you get the support of these members who don't have mass transit agencies in their districts?
Well, it's a little bit of, I scratch your back, you scratch my back. If you need, some more roads and bridges here, and I need, more trains in West Philly, then, and I think the business community can play a role in that too, because what these agencies do and what the highway funding does is allows people to get to their jobs, and it allows goods and services to move. We are the Keystone State, right? And we have more miles of paved road than all of our adjoining neighbors combined. So we have a lot of infrastructure. It's old. We've had toll roads here since forever. It seems like every road in Lancaster is called the such and such pike, which is back in how they did roads way back when. So we have to keep up this infrastructure. And so many of our jobs are in warehousing, transportation, logistics, and that makes you want to have really good infrastructure in transportation. So I think that'll be one area where there'll be more agreement than not.
And I think that they could see the possibility of having mass transit in their communities. I live in a suburb of Harrisburg. There is not a convenient public transit option for me to go from my home to Harrisburg for work. I think that that's true in a lot of different communities, and they would see a huge boost in people able to work longer hours, different jobs if they were simply able to get there. Because personal vehicle ownership is not feasible for a lot of people, particularly those near the minimum wage.
Now, this isn't specifically tied to the budget, but on the issue of transportation, there are separate bills in the House and Senate right now that would place a fee on electric vehicle ownership. Do you see the potential for compromise on this?
I own an electric vehicle, so I'm not thrilled about this one. But no, it makes sense. So our roads are funded now through the vehicle tax, essentially, that you pay on the gas end. So with my plug-in hybrid, I'm not using nearly as much gas, but I am on 81 just as much as I was when I still had a fully gas-powered vehicle. This is a future-oriented solution that I'm glad to see the legislature looking at. Everyone should pay the rate that is appropriate for their usage of the roads. And right now, us electric vehicles are getting away with something.
I want to talk about this issue more because I can blame Brittany. That works out really good for me. But Brittany's right. You need to get folks who are driving EVs or hybrids, get them caught up because the roads quake underneath their vehicles just as much as they do under my gas-powered sedan. So I think that is an issue that's coming to a head because more and more people, this is not some kind of interesting pie-in-the-sky idea like it was maybe 8 years ago. We have a lot more people driving EVs or hybrids out there. So I think it's gotten to the point where pretty much everybody knows somebody or themselves that does this. So it's easier to do it's easier to do the math. And the reason the gas tax worked well for so long is because everybody had to buy gas. So it was a very equitable way. You drove more, you paid more in taxes. Now that system is broken. So how they figure out how much to charge a scofflaw like Brittany in her, hybrid, I don't know the magic to that, but it will help. And I think if most EV drivers are like Brittany, realize that something needs to happen. Now, I don't know if that means that every year you get a bill from PennDOT or every quarter, or you make them put in your mileage so you can figure out an equivalent of gas tax to EV miles. That's way above my pay grade. I haven't taken a math class in a while, but I'm sure smarter minds than mine are at work on this so we can get it out.
This is an interesting problem to address because the percentage of electric vehicle users is going to skyrocket over the next 5 or 6 years. And these bills are introduced sort of in companionship with planning bills. Right now, our electric grid can't handle the coming demand in electric vehicles, so we need a planning process in place with the PUC, utility companies, and some oversight from the legislature on how we're going to handle as municipal fleets, your police cars, fire trucks, et cetera, move to electric as individuals do, and as private companies, as trucking systems and major shippers are using electric vehicles. I come home at work at 5 o'clock, I plug in my car, so does everybody else on my block. But that's going to lead to
Where do you
surge
live,
prices.
Brittany, where everyone has a hybrid?
I was the third on my block, actually, so I'm a little behind.
And let's remember, there are other ways to power cars besides electric and gas. There's natural gas alternatives, hydrogen alternatives, although right now that's more for fleet. So the big reason we don't have enough infrastructure, I'm going to use air quotes again, the reason we don't have enough infrastructure on the grid is because no one wants high power lines built anywhere near their property or their line of sight. And you need those high tension lines to carry the electricity, so we can dance around it all you want. But until you start building more of them, and look, I'm in the same boat. I don't want high power lines to come into my neighborhood. My neighborhood's old and developed, so it wouldn't come there anyway. But you have to produce more power in the first place, which Democrats seem allergic to, and then you have to move it to folks, right? So all of that involves doing things that people don't like, which is siting power plants, having nuclear power plants, new ones come online, and building those towers. So that is where the rubber hits the road.
Another less discussed facet that the governor had proposed was regulating and taxing skills games. Can you talk a little bit about some of the arguments surrounding this and where this issue sits right now in the legislature?
I'm tired of talking about skills games. Brittany and I do another show together called This Week in Pennsylvania, and there have been a couple tense shows there between the casino folks and the skills games people. All I know is I can't go anywhere up and down Dairy Street where I live in suburban Harrisburg without seeing a sign on a otherwise, totally different establishment that says play Pennsylvania skills games here. So the market has spoken. People like to play them. So I think it behooves the powers that be to figure out a way to regulate and tax them so people are not taken advantage of. And right now it seems like they're growing without any oversight. So we obviously know how to regulate gambling in the state. I know the skills games people say it's not gambling, but to the user, it's essentially gambling. You put money in the machine, you push buttons, and you try to get money back. So, as I said on our other show, there must be so much money involved because these people keep having these very in-depth and tense arguments. So, okay, let's figure it out and move on to the next problem.
The video gaming terminals, the things that are popping up everywhere. There's one in an ice cream shop in Carlisle where I live now. They're truly everywhere. They've existed in murky legal water for some time. The manufacturers of them say that it's a skill game, that it's not slots. So slot games have to exist only in casinos, which the state regulates and taxes at a very, very high rate. These machines keep popping up. They have had mixed court rulings on whether they are in fact legal, but as part of the budget this year, there's a move to legalize them and tax them at a rate that is hopefully inching closer to what they actually are, which is nearly a slot game. But like Chris says, we know how to regulate gambling. We know that this is a form of gambling. It's just a matter of legally bringing them into the fold and managing them the same way we do other machines.
Let's connect the dots. Let's regulate them, tax them, use that money to increase the minimum wage. Then we solve two problems, right, Brittany?
No, we did that in like 45 minutes.
I know, really.
Somebody should elect the two of you. We only have a few minutes left. So the budget deadline is June 30th. How important is that deadline, and do factors like it being an election year play a role in how quickly that happens?
Yes, election year plays a big role in it. You don't want to be the incumbent sitting in Harrisburg, stuck there when you'd rather be home knocking on doors. You don't want to get beat up for having a late budget. So there's a lot of pressure on the incumbents to get something done on time. However, June 30th is more of a dream. We don't typically reach it. Usually we're a couple days late, and it's usually those associated vehicle bills that tell you how to drive out the money that are late rather than the full appropriation. It is a good goal, but ultimately I think we found that voters don't care. Voters typically don't know that that's the budget deadline. It doesn't impact their day-to-day life. It impacts their life in September when schools aren't getting their payments, when things are falling by the wayside, when their public parks aren't being cleaned, things like that. But whether it's June 30th or July 7th, I don't think it makes a huge amount of difference.
So back in the day, before you were around, Brittany, the laws were different. So if there's no budget, then the state employees didn't get paid, and that was a big deal around here. It didn't mean so much to people in Venango County or Bradford County, but around here it did. Then they changed the law that said the state employees would still get paid, which is good, so you can't hold them hostage. So now there's really no consequences to it being July 7th or, July 15th or June 29th. I think everyone is committed to doing it on time. It's not like this is a new idea, but they're going to hash it out, and I would not take bets right now on June 30th, right? Kind of the over-under being June 30th or before or after. I'd bet the after, but hope springs eternal, right?
Our guests have been Christopher Nicholas from Eagle Consulting Group and Brit Crampsie from Brit Crampsie Communications. Thank you both for joining us. PCN's Ellen Front spoke earlier with Senator Jimmy Dillion about his legislation on illegal street racing.
Welcome to our program. How did illegal street racing in Pennsylvania come to your attention?
Sure. So in the short term that I've been in here, Ellen, in the less than 2 years, it's just been a quality of life issue here. It's been a public safety issue here in the Northeast, specifically where I'm from, but all throughout Philadelphia. So just getting the attention through civic associations, seeing stuff throughout the news and on social media, felt like it was a good time to enact a bill like this.
Currently, what is the punishment for somebody who is caught street racing?
So currently, there's obviously a lot just left in the judicial space where people here, right? Title 75 kind of bans certain type of street racing here, right? Senator Farry and I have gotten together, and with the times and things have raised up here, we see that drifting and illegal racing and stuff is becoming more and more common. The idea of it isn't necessarily geared toward punishment and the details of consequences, but more toward the issue of prevention and public safety and quality of life from what's being done on our streets.
So would this bill change any of the regulations against street racing? I know you mentioned drifting. Will that become illegal under the street racing bill?
Yeah, that's the whole idea of it. It's just adding as a prohibited activity that's coming along with street racing, right? It's identified toward vehicles that are intentionally drifting or skidding into property, into other vehicles, into things. It's becoming much more common in the world today.
Are there certain instances in which street racing is legal as long as it's regulated, or is there no situation where it would be legal at all?
I can only speak for our county here in Philadelphia. It's been a major quality of life and a major thing here. I know it's been banned and illegal here in Philadelphia a while. I'm not sure of other counties throughout the area, but definitely here in Philadelphia, with just being such a populated city, there's really no room for it on our streets.
Do any of the punishments that come from this bill, does that extend to people who are involved in these races without driving? So like anyone who may be watching or who coordinate these races, are they going to be punished just like if they were driving the car?
Surely. Well, listen, with the wonderful world of social media these days, it's so easy to coordinate. It's so easy to gather. It's so easy to host something. So we are going to put some restrictions on monitoring these people who are responsible for having these gatherings all hours of the nights, all places throughout Philadelphia. And we're putting some restrictions and some laws in there to make sure that, again, we keep the public safety there and keep a close eye on what's being gathered and what's being kind of controlled here throughout Philadelphia.
This bill recently passed the Senate. Where is it in the legislative process right now?
Again, it did. It went through the Transportation Committee unanimously, and then it went through the Senate 49-1. It is over in the House of Representatives, and we are looking forward to a lot of support from our legislators over in the House. Again, we're not looking to turn around and do anything that's rocket science here, right? It's all about prevention and protection, public safety, and quality of life issues that we're hoping everybody's going to be on board for on the other side of the chamber.
Have you heard anything so far about the House? Have they said anything about it so far?
I have not. Again, Senator Farry and I obviously work well together in terms of our measures here, being neighboring senators. And I know that we're going to be reaching out to our House reps from both of our Senate districts to kind of lead the way here. Representative Nielsen is heading the Transportation Committee over there, so I'm sure he's very familiar with things. And being a Northeast guy, he is well aware of the issues that are going on here in Philadelphia as well. So we're very optimistic and looking for some positive support in terms of the bill.
Senator Jimmy Dillion, thank you for your time.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan.
That concludes today's show. The PCN Capitol Preview returns tomorrow as we discuss the 2024 general election with Ray Zaborny of Red Maverick Media and Jim Byrne, former chair of the Pennsylvania Democratic State Committee. That's tomorrow morning, live at 9 a.m. I'm Francine Schertzer. Thank you for watching.